Mercury is the smallest planet in our solar system and the closest one to the Sun. As one of the 4 terrestrial planets, it has a solid surface and it's made of silicate rocks or metals. To be more specific, it's mostly made out of iron. Despite the naming coincidence, there's actually no Mercury, the element, in Mercury, the planet. Mercury is named after the swiftest of the Roman gods, which is very fitting because it zips around the Sun faster than any other planet in the solar system. It's one of the 5 classical planets visible with the naked eye. Of these planets, it's the most elusive and difficult to spot. It's never visible in complete darkness and only appears within a couple hours before sunrise or after sunset. In classical Greece, Mercury was known by 2 names. When appearing before sunrise, it was known as Apollo. When appearing after sunset, it was known as Hermes. It's the latter that ultimately became the planet's namesake in a way because Mercury is Hermes' Roman equivalent. The Sumerians knew of Mercury at least 5,000 years ago. The planet was commonly associated with Nabu, the god of writing. Mercury was first observed through telescopes in the 17th century by Galileo Galilei and Thomas Harriot. Of all the terrestrial planets, Mercury is the least explored. This is mostly because its proximity to the Sun makes it very difficult to send spacecraft to. So far, only 2 spacecraft have actually explored Mercury, Mariner 10 and Messenger. However, there is a third currently on its way to the planet, and it's predicted to make it there in December of 2025. Since Mercury is so close to the Sun, you might think that it's super hot all the time or that it's the hottest planet in the solar system. But both of those assumptions would be incorrect. The hottest planet in the solar system is actually Venus, and Mercury's surface temperatures swing wildly between very, very hot and very, very cold. During the day, temperatures on Mercury can reach as high as 800 degrees Fahrenheit, but at night, when part of the planet is facing away from the Sun, those temperatures can drop to negative 290 degrees Fahrenheit, because Mercury lacks an atmosphere that could retain heat. Really makes you realize how lucky we are here on Earth. Imagine if we were hundreds of degrees below zero every night. That would suck. Mercury has a radius of 1,516 miles, making it just a teeny bit larger than Earth's moon. It also resembles our moon in that it's covered in impact craters. Mercury is the 2nd densest planet after Earth. Much of this density is due to its large iron core, which could be partly molten or liquid. Mercury's outer shell is about 250 miles thick, which means its core takes up an awful lot of its volume. One of the mysteries around Mercury is how it formed and why it has such a massive iron core. There's one theory that states it originally had more material on its outer shell that just got blasted away from the surface over the years. Most of Mercury's surface would appear grayish-brown to the human eye. The dark hue of the surface is due to carbon. This carbon was not deposited by impacting comets, but it may instead be a remnant of the planet's primordial crust. In the past, Mercury's surface may have been constantly reshaped by volcanic activity, but it's likely all volcanic eruptions on this planet stopped about 3.5 billion years ago. Many of the impact craters on Mercury's surface are named after deceased authors, musicians, and artists. Very large impact basins on the planet were created by asteroid impacts early into the solar system's history. For example, there's the Caloris Basin. This formed about 4 billion years ago when Mercury was struck by an asteroid about 60 miles wide. This impact left a crater about 960 miles wide. Among Mercury's many impact craters, there are some areas of smooth terrain. The planet also has a lot of large cliffs that can be hundreds of miles long and stretch up to a mile high. These cliffs rose as the planet's interior cooled and contracted. If you look at a picture of Mercury, you'll probably notice those bright streaks across its surface. These streaks are called crater rays. They form when an asteroid or comet strikes the surface. The energy of the impact digs a hole and crushes a lot of rock at the point of impact. Some of this crushed material is ejected, thrown very far from the crater, and falls back down to the surface, creating the rays. They appear brighter because the fine particles of crushed rock are more reflective. Over time, the space environment causes the rays to darken. Also, Mercury is still shrinking. It's made up of a single continental plate over an iron core, and that core is still cooling. It contracts as it cools, reducing the planet's volume and causing shrinkage. Look at how small it can get. A day on Mercury is a bit tricky. You could measure it by how long it takes to make one spin on its axis, in which case it would be about 59 Earth days. Or you could measure the solar day, which is how long it takes the sun to return to the same spot in the sky. A full day-night cycle, basically. If you use this measurement, then a day on Mercury is about 176 Earth days. Why is Mercury's solar day so long when it takes a comparatively short time to spin on its axis? It's a combination of its super fast orbit around the sun and its very slow spin on its axis. Both of these combine to give it a solar day twice as long as its year. That's right, Mercury only takes 88 days to orbit once around the sun. Mercury is on a 3-to-2 spin-orbit resonance with the sun. This means it spins on its axis 3 times for every 2 times it goes around the sun. Mercury's orbit isn't perfectly round, but instead it's kind of egg-shaped. At its closest to the sun, it's only 29 million miles away, but at its farthest, it's about 43 million miles. That makes an average of about 36 million miles. At this average distance, it takes light about 3.2 minutes to reach Mercury from the sun. Mercury travels through space at an average of 29 miles per second. It moves faster when it's closer to the sun. During this point in its orbit, each rotation is not accompanied by sunrise and sunset at some parts of its surface. Instead, the sun will appear to rise briefly before setting and then rising again, and vice versa for sunset. Mercury has an axial tilt of only 2 degrees. This means it spins almost exactly upright, and because of this, it doesn't experience any seasons. It's always just either really hot or really cold, depending on where you are. Unlike Earth, Mercury doesn't have an atmosphere. Instead, it has a very thin exosphere made up of atoms blasted off the surface by asteroids and solar wind. This exosphere is mostly made of oxygen, sodium, hydrogen, helium, and potassium. Mercury's exosphere is incapable of stopping or slowing impacts from extraterrestrial objects. This is why the planet is covered in so many impact craters. Stuff just keeps crashing into it because there's no atmosphere to protect it. The discovery of Mercury's magnetic field was a surprise. A magnetic field is theoretically only possible if a planet spins very fast and has a molten core, but Mercury spins very slowly, and it's so small that its core should have cooled off long ago. To explain this, it's theorized that its core may be turning from liquid to solid at the outer boundary rather than the center. Mercury's magnetic field is offset relative to its equator. The field is about 3 times stronger in the northern hemisphere than in the southern, but the magnetic field is still very weak. It's like 1% the strength of Earth's. The magnetic field does do something pretty cool though. It interacts with the magnetic field of solar wind to sometimes create magnetic tornadoes. These tornadoes funnel the plasma of solar wind down to the surface of Mercury. When it hits the surface, it knocks off neutrally charged atoms and sends them flying onto a loop into the sky. Mercury has magnetic tornadoes. How cool is that? It's difficult to find an explanation on Mercury being in retrograde that doesn't involve a bunch of astrology, but it is an actual phenomenon. Because Mercury has a much shorter orbit than Earth, and both planets are orbiting the sun in the same direction, Mercury overtakes Earth in its orbit about 3 or 4 times a year. This causes an optical illusion where Mercury seems to move backwards through the sky, but the direction of Mercury's orbit hasn't actually changed. It only appears to move backwards, and that's what it means when Mercury is in retrograde. Other planets can be in retrograde too. For Venus, it's similar to Mercury. It overtakes Earth. But for planets like Mars that are further out, it's a bit different because instead it's Earth overtaking that planet and not the other way around. So yeah, that's a neat little thing that happens. On occasion, as in 13 or 14 times a century, Mercury passes directly between Earth and the Sun. This event is known as a transit of Mercury. It's similar to a solar eclipse. During a transit, Mercury appears like a tiny dot moving across the surface of the Sun for a few hours. Obviously, you can't see this with the naked eye. You would just blind yourself by staring at the Sun. Modern transits of Mercury always happen within a few days of May 8th and November 10th. The last transit happened on November 11th, 2019. The next one will happen on November 12th or 13th, 2032. Mercury has no moons. Its proximity to the sun is probably the reason for this. The sun's gravity would just yoink any moons out of orbit around Mercury. Mercury doesn't have any rings either. There may be water in deep craters at Mercury's north and south poles. Because of the planet's near vertical spin, the poles are never fully sunlit. These permanent shadows are cold enough to preserve water ice. How did water get on Mercury? Comets and meteorites could have delivered it there, or the water vapor outgassed, that is, released, from the planet's interior and then froze at the poles. Either way, it's a pretty interesting find. The existence of water doesn't make Mercury a habitable planet, though. The extreme temperatures and lack of an atmosphere make it impossible for life as we know it to exist there. Mariner 10 was the first spacecraft to visit Mercury. It imaged about 45% of the planet's surface and detected its magnetic field. It explored both Mercury and Venus during its mission. Mariner 10 launched on November 3, 1973. It had the primary goal of studying Mercury's atmosphere, surface, and physical characteristics. On March 29, 1974, it had a close encounter when it flew 473 miles from Mercury. It then looped around the Sun to fly past Mercury again on September 21st, 1974. This flyby added imagery of the southern polar region. During its 3 Mercury flybys, Mariner 10 returned around 2,700 photos of the planet. The last contact with the spacecraft occurred on March 24th, 1975, after it exhausted its supply of gas. Mariner 10 is presumably still out there, just orbiting around the sun, but it hasn't been seen or detected in the nearly 50 years since its mission concluded. The name of this spacecraft stands for Mercury Surface Space Environment, Geochemistry, and Ranging. It was the second spacecraft to visit Mercury and the first to orbit the planet. Messenger's primary mission was to study the geology, magnetic field, and chemical composition of Mercury. It was the first mission to visit Mercury after Mariner 10 over 30 years earlier. Messenger launched on August 3, 2004. Its journey to Mercury included multiple gravity assist maneuvers, including one flyby of Earth, 2 flybys of Venus, and 3 flybys of Mercury. On March 18, 2011, nearly 7 years after its launch, Messenger entered orbit around Mercury. It began formal data collection a few weeks later on April 4th of the same year. It had a highly elliptical orbit with an orbital period of about 12 hours. Messenger's original 1-year mission ended on March 17, 2012, by which it had taken nearly 100,000 photos of Mercury. The mission had several extensions to continue collecting more data. Messenger's mission finally concluded on April 30th, 2015, when it ran out of fuel and crashed into Mercury's surface at 8,750 miles per hour. This impact, of course, left a new crater on Mercury. The Bepi-Colombo spacecraft launched on October 20th, 2018, and it's currently on its 7-year journey to Mercury. It's expected to enter orbit around Mercury in December of 2025. It has a 1-year mission planned with a possible 1-year extension. Bepi-Colombo is a joint mission between the European Space Agency and the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency. Its goal is to answer some questions we have about Mercury. Why is there ice in polar craters? Why does Mercury have a magnetic field? What are these hollows on its surface? The spacecraft has already had 3 flybys of Mercury, and there are 3 more planned before it will enter orbit around the planet. When it achieves that goal, it will become the second spacecraft to orbit Mercury. Not much remains to be said at this point. I love Mercury. I feel like it's overlooked a lot because it's the tiniest planet and the least explored of the terrestrial ones, but I have a warm spot in my heart for Mercury. It's very cool, and also very hot. I hope you love Mercury too, and also that you enjoyed this video. Thanks for sticking around, and have a great day.